everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this presentation on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I am a senior associate with Scott Legal PC here in New York City. Just a few things, housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar, as I mentioned, is on the TN visa, which is one of the most common visas that we help our clients pursue, and for good reasons. If you are a national of Canada or Mexico, and you're looking to work in the US, there are few better visa options, better insofar as the process being fast and fairly straightforward and simple. So the TN, if someone comes to us with a passport from Canada or Mexico looking to work in the US, the TN is going to likely be the first option we consider. Our firm, however, even though we focus on business immigration, we are a full service immigration firm. So we do help clients who are pursuing green cards, who are pursuing family-based visas, humanitarian visas, as well as employment-based green cards, which is a permanent option if you want to work in the US and eventually pursue citizenship if that's something you're interested in. So regardless of what immigration issue or question you have, we do hope you'll come to us and reach out for assistance. We'd be happy to help. Our firm's founder, Ian Scott, was actually on a TN visa for some time. So his experience navigating that process firsthand really does inform the way that we work with our clients. This webinar is part of a series. We try to do at least 2 webinars a week, and those do span a variety of immigration options. We record all of our webinars and we post them to our YouTube channel. So even if you're not able to attend a webinar live, we do hope you'll check it out on YouTube, as well as our full-length webinars. We do have shorter videos on our YouTube channel, and again, those span the full range of visa options. So do check those out. After this presentation, we'll send you a link to our YouTube channel, as well as a link to our blog, where we also have some wonderful information for free on the TN and other options. We'll send you a comprehensive guide to the TN visa, as well as the PowerPoint presentation that you see on your screen. That email that you'll receive will also have a link where you can schedule a consultation with an attorney at our office. And you can choose either 30 minutes or an hour. And we'd be happy to talk through the specifics of your case, your goals, the circumstances of your application and what you're planning. A consultation is really the best place to do that, and we'd be happy to help you with that. If you have questions during the presentation, I do plan to get to all questions that come in. Feel free to send them in through either the chat function on Zoom or the question and answer function on Zoom. I have both open on my screen, so I'll be monitoring those. I might save questions for the end, but either way, I do plan to get through all of the questions, so don't hesitate to send those in. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in by talking about the TN visa requirements. So to qualify for a TN visa, the first thing you need is a passport from either Canada or Mexico. The TN visa is rooted in NAFTA, an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So you do need to hold a passport from Canada or Mexico. You don't need to have been born in Canada or Mexico. So even if you were born in India and you naturalized in Canada and you now have a passport from Canada, that is sufficient for a TN visa. Now, you need to be coming to the US to work in a profession that is actually listed in the NAFTA regulations. And so at this point, I'll encourage everyone who's on this webinar, if you are at your computer or on your phone, Google NAFTA TN regulations and actually pull up the regulations. So it's section 214.6. And as you scroll down the regulations, you will see a list of dozens of occupations. The first is accountant. The next is architect. Goes down the list all the way to dentists, nutritionists, biochemists, biologists, and then college, seminary, and university teachers. So there really are literally dozens of professions listed in the in the regulations. So you need to be coming to the US to work in one of these listed professions. You cannot get a TN visa if you're not coming to the US to work in one of these professions. Now, for each of these professions, there are listed qualifications, and you need to actually satisfy these qualifications for the profession you're coming to the US to fill. So, for example, if you are coming to the US to work as an accountant, you look at the regulations and you see that accountants require a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or a professional license, a CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. So for an accountant, you can either have a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or a professional license. Let's look at an economist. For an economist, you need either a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. So you cannot qualify as an economist based on some professional license. You need that degree. Let's go to management consultants. So for management consultants, you can have either a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or equivalent professional experience. And that can be 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So you see that management consultants have several options. They can qualify based on a degree or based on 5 years of experience. Accountants can qualify based on a professional license, whereas economists need that degree. So for whatever profession you're coming to the US to fill, go to the regulations and make sure that you have the qualification requirement, whether that's a degree, a professional license, or experience. It's typically going to be one of those three. One quick note, when you see baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, the degree does need to be related to the profession. So for example, if you're coming to the US as an economist, again, you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree to come to the US as an economist on a TN. And you have a baccalaureate degree, but it is in English. That is going to be a tough application. The degree should be related to the profession. So if you do have a degree in English, let's say you have a baccalaureate degree in English, but a master's degree in economics, that would be fine. So when you see baccalaureate or licenciatura, it's kind of a minimal requirement. So a master's in economics would be fine if you're coming as an economist. A PhD in economics would be fine. But what if you don't have a master's or a PhD? You have a baccalaureate degree in English. So if that's you, then what you'll need to show is your transcript, and you'll need to show that you took classes that qualify you to work as an economist. So that would be still a challenging application if you're applying as an economist and your undergraduate degree is in English, and you did take some classes in economics. That would still be a tough sell. But there's an argument to be made, and you'd want to emphasize your transcript and that your coursework does qualify you for this work. What if your degree, though, is not in English, it's in math or finance, statistics? That's getting closer to an economics degree, and I think there is a stronger argument that your degree is related to the profession if it's a math degree, if it's a finance degree, and you're applying as an economist. And of course, if your undergraduate degree is in economics, then that clearly qualifies you. If your degree is on a slightly unrelated note, if your degree is from a school that is in Canada, Mexico, or the United States, you do not need an educational equivalency certificate. So that's where a company in the US looks at your transcript and says, this is equivalent to a bachelor's degree in the US. You don't need that if the school is in Mexico, Canada, or the US. You do need that if the school is anywhere outside of those three countries. So even if you have a degree in economics from the London School of Economics or from Oxford, University of Cambridge, all very well-known, renowned, respected universities, you do still need that equivalency certificate since the school is not in the United States, Canada, or Mexico. If the school is in Mexico, you do typically need translations. So English translations are generally required. All right, so returning to our list, must be a citizen of Canada or Mexico. The profession you're coming to the US to fill must be on the list of professions. You must satisfy the qualifications for that profession. You need to have a job offer, so a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. Now, fortunately, the employer in the US really can take almost any form. It can be a corporation, it can be an LLC, it can be a sole proprietor. But you do need to have a job offer from an employer in the US, and you cannot own that employer in the US. So if you went to school in the US, you let's say, went to accounting school and you started an accounting firm in the US and you own a good part of that company, let's say 50%, you cannot be working for that accounting firm on a TN because you own the company. So that is one of the clear restrictions on a TN. But as long as you don't own the company and you have that job offer in the US, that satisfies this requirement. You need a prearranged job offer. A defined length of time. So the TN will give you status for up to 3 years. So typically the defined length of time for the job is 3 years or less. And in that job that you've received a job offer for, you need to be engaging in the professional activities that are consistent with that job. So what does this mean? This means if you are coming to the US, let's say, to work as an economist, you need to be working as an economist. You can't be coming to the US, say, to manage their social media account. All right, that is not what an economist does according to the government. So how do you know what the government thinks an occupation does? The key resource on this is called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or the OOH. It's a publication of the US Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So what you'd want to do is once you've decided which profession you're coming to the US to fill, you would Google that profession's name and then OOH. So let's take accountants as an example. If we Google OOH accountants, click the link to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, and then you'll see a tab at the top of the screen that says what they do. If you click that tab, you see job duties or duties. And it says accountants typically do the following. They examine financial statements, they compute taxes, they inspect account books, they organize, analyze, and maintain financial records, assess financial operations, and they suggest ways to reduce costs, enhance revenues, and improve profits. And so that's just a little bit of what they do. There's an extensive description here of what they do. But you need to make sure if you're coming to the US as an accountant, for example, you're doing things, your job duties are aligned with those on the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And the same is true of any of the professions. If you're coming to the US as a biologist, as a management consultant, as an economist, look up that profession on the OOH and make sure that what you'll be doing in the US is consistent. Doesn't need to be identical. It doesn't need to be verbatim, but the job duties need to be aligned with what are in the OOH. If they're not, then when you apply for the TN, the government official will likely look at your job title, look at your job duties, and then say, I don't think this is actually what someone in this job does. And you're facing a denial in that case. So you do want to make sure you're doing job duties aligned with what the government thinks the job does, which again are defined in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So what is sponsorship? We have a slide on this. This is the title of this presentation as well. Does TN require sponsorship? And the reason is this is one of the most common questions that we get around the TN visa. So to answer the question, it's important to first define what is sponsorship. So in US immigration law, sponsorship is something where a US employer has certain responsibilities toward the employee that are based on the visa the employee is trying to get. So for example, in the H-1B context, the employer has to pay a prevailing wage, which is higher than minimum wage typically. The employer needs to pay for return transportation of the employee if they lose their job. The employer, the U.S. employer, may need to test the U.S. labor market, might need to offer the job to U.S. workers, see if anyone's interested. These are all significant responsibilities and quite time-consuming steps to take. And again, they apply in the H-1B context. Certain requirements apply in the employment-based green card context. None of these requirements apply in the TN context. So that's why, to directly answer the question, we would say that the TN visa does not require sponsorship. The TN visa, all that it requires of the U.S. employer is that the U.S. employer sign a letter that is honest and is accurate, that explains who the company is, who the U.S. employer is, why they need someone in your position, in your profession, who you are as the applicant, how you qualify for the TN, and why you're a good fit for the U.S. company, how long they're planning to employ you, again, typically 3 years or less, how much they plan to pay you, and what your job duties will be in the US. And that's really it. That needs to be signed by them. It needs to be printed on their letterhead. But once they provide that letter, their responsibility insofar as the visa is concerned is really done. Again, assuming they're sincere about it. So the letter does need to be accurate and honest, but after that, the responsibility is the same as it would be really for any employee in the US that they have. So in other words, once the TN applicant provides that letter, say at the port of entry, they're admitted into the US, they would start working for the US employer, and they would be treated as any other employee would be treated. So for example, the employer would complete an I-9. The TN status and their passport would typically be sufficient for that. And then the US employer would pay them a minimum. They must comply with minimum wage laws, as they must for any US employer. And once they are doing that, that's their wage requirement. They don't need to pay a prevailing wage, as they would say in the H1. Excuse me, sorry about that. I had an issue with my microphone. So basically, the requirements toward the TN employee are the same as they would be for any other US employee once the TN application is filed. The one caveat to this is if the employee is filing through USCIS, then the employer will sign and file the Form I-129, which is the application that goes to USCIS. That does not create any additional responsibilities that would be created through any other application options, such as writing the letter, but the employer would need to sign that form, and it would be submitted on their behalf. So if it is denied, it is the employer's application getting denied, whereas if the employee is applying at a consulate or at a port of entry, it is the employee's application that is denied. A subtle difference, but it is a meaningful one. So, as I mentioned before, the TN is open to nationals of Canada or Mexico, and only nationals of those two countries. The application process is different, however, depending on whether you are a national of Canada or Mexico. So let's start with nationals of Mexico. Nationals of Mexico have really two options to apply for a TN. The first is if they are outside the US, they must apply at a US consulate abroad. They would do that by filing a DS-160 online. They would be called in for an interview, and they would bring their TN application with them. So that would be the employer letter that I mentioned before, proof that they qualify for the job, whether that's their diploma, their transcript, or experience letters, things like that. Their passport, of course, and they would attend an interview. And then once the interview is done, they would receive their passport back along with the TN visa. They also, nationals of Mexico, also have the option, if they're inside the US, to apply through USCIS. So they would do that by the employer, the US employer, filing the I-129 form. And that would also include the supporting documents I mentioned before, copies of the employer letter, copies of the diploma or experience letters, how the applicant qualifies. At a consulate, you do need original documents. At USCIS, you do not need to provide original documents. You can provide copies. Nationals of Canada have a third option to apply, and it is by far the easiest and most straightforward and fastest option, which is Nationals of Canada can apply at a port of entry. So that can be either an airport or a land crossing. And all they would do is approach the port of entry with their application materials, the employer letter, originals of the employer letter, an original of their diploma, their transcript, experience letters, however they're qualifying. And they would present their application to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Officer, who, if they're approved, then would admit them into the U.S. for a period of up to 3 years in TN status. So that is, again, by far the easiest, most efficient, and least expensive option to apply for a TN. So Nationals of Canada really do have a very straightforward option for the TN. Nationals of Mexico do as well. It's just it is more time consuming. It is slightly more expensive to apply through a consulate. But still, compared to other visa options, the TN is still a very straightforward, simple, and quite efficient option, even for nationals of Mexico. So I mentioned at the start of this presentation that there are dozens of professions. You need to be coming to the US to work in one of those listed professions. Not all of them are created equal. So certain professions are more challenging than others. And two of the most challenging professions in the TN world are the management consultant profession and the economist profession. And this is for two very different reasons. The reasons they're difficult are completely different. So the reason that management consultants, those applications tend to be challenging is because the management consultant category is one of the very few categories that does not require a degree. So the US government is aware that if someone is a national of Canada or Mexico and they want to come into the US on a TN and they don't have a college degree, the management consultant category is almost certainly going to be the category they apply for, even if they are not actually going to be working as a management consultant. So as a result, the government really does scrutinize management consultant applications. If you recall, looking at the regulations, you can qualify for the management consulting category with 5 years either as a management consultant or 5 years in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. So this really is a spectrum. In other words, certain management consultant applications are straightforward and are not particularly risky. Those are if you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm as a management consultant. So if you live in Canada, you're working for Boston Consulting Group in Canada, and they want to send you to the US to work for Boston Consulting Group in New York City, then that is not a complicated application. Or if they want you to come to the US and be on site at a client's company, that's not particularly challenging. You're working as a management consultant and you're working for a management consulting firm. What is challenging is if the company in the US is not a management consulting firm, or you're not coming to the US to work in an area that's clearly management consulting. So let me give an example of what this looks like in practice. So if you are coming to the US, an example I like to use is a US employer that makes solar panels. this is a US employer. They design solar panels, they manufacture solar panels, and they sell solar panels. And you are an expert in solar panels and you live and work in Mexico. So this solar panel company in the US wants to hire you to come to the US and help them improve their manufacturing processes, their efficiencies, things like that. So that's a great example where you would be coming to the US to work for a company that is not a management consulting company. It is a solar panel company. And it's not exactly clear that you're working as a management consultant. You need to make that argument in the application that what you'll be doing is actually performing job duties aligned with the management consultant category. So how do you strengthen that application? The first thing that would be recommended is to go to the OOH and look up management consultant. So I'm doing that right now. They call these workers management analysts. So it's the same thing. You click what they do. They gather and organize information. I'm looking at the job duties, again, clicking the what they do link, tab at the top of the page. They gather and organize information about the problems to be solved. They interview personnel, conduct observations, to determine the methods, equipment, and personnel that will be needed. They analyze financial and other data. They develop solutions. They recommend solutions, make recommendations to management, and they confer with managers to ensure that changes are working. So you need to make sure as a first step that what you'll be doing in the US is aligned with those job duties. Okay. So the second thing to make sure of is that the application clearly defines the problem that you'll be coming to the US to address. So management consultants address a problem. So you need to define that problem in the application. You also need to define how long the employer needs to define this really, how long it will take to address that problem. And ideally that will be less than 3 years. Because what you're trying to avoid here is what the government is sensitive to is people who come to the US as a management consultant to fill a full-time job. So that application would be denied. If you're coming to the US, say, and you say, I'm coming to the US as a management consultant and I'm going to be working at this company to fill a role that the company already has. And it's going to be 3 years and I'm going to be on payroll. That looks like full-time permanent employment, as opposed to what a management consultant usually looks like, which is think of McKinsey or BCG. A company will hire them to come in, address a very specific problem. The McKinsey consultant is not put on W-2 payroll by the company hiring them, hiring McKinsey. Instead, they really are coming in as a consultant. It's likely an independent contractor agreement for a finite period of time to address a very specific problem. That's what the TN application needs to look like as well. So how do you do that? We recommend having, if it's appropriate, having a consulting agreement between the US employer and the management consultant. That should define the period of time they're going to be in the US addressing issues. It should define how much they're going to be paid, what the deliverables are, what the management consultant is going to do, maybe performing observations, making recommendations, things like that, analyzing financial information and data. Typically, an independent contractor agreement is most appropriate for these applications. So again, you're trying to make it clear to the US government that this is a legitimate management consultant arrangement rather than a full-time employee arrangement. All right, that's the management consultant category. The economist category is also challenging, but for a completely different reason. In 2017, the US government issued a policy memo that really narrowed the scope of what the government is supposed to consider that economists do in the TN category. So to start off, what economists do is, again, outlined in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So I always recommend OOH and then the profession, which here is economist. If you click economist, what they do. What do economists do? Economists research economic issues related to education, the labor force, international trade, and other topics. They conduct surveys, collect data, analyze that data using mathematical models, statistics, and other software. They interpret and forecast trends. They advise businesses, governments, and individuals, and they present their research in tables, graphs, and articles. Now, again, there is a further description here on the OOH, so you can use that to your advantage. But what do economists not do? So this is what the policy memo in 2017 made clear, that the government does not consider two categories of work to fall in the scope of economists. The first is financial analysts, and the second is market research analysts. So if you're coming to the US to work as a financial analyst, you would not qualify as an economist. And if you're coming to the US to work as a market research analyst, you would not qualify as an economist. So financial analysts. The government considers financial analysts to primarily conduct quantitative analyses of information affecting investments. Okay, so their job is to find opportunities to commit money for the purpose of generating profits. All right, they're looking for opportunities to invest money to generate profits. Market research analysts, on the other hand, gather and analyze data helping companies market their products or services. So if you are primarily focused on marketing, then there's a good chance you'll fall into that market research analyst category and would therefore not be found to qualify as an economist. So if you are coming to the US to work as a financial analyst or as a market research analyst, then you may want to look at other categories that may be better fit. So it's possible that the management consulting category might fit. But at the end of the day, if the job duties just do not align with the TN categories, then unfortunately the TN might not be a good fit, and you may need to find another visa option. That could be an H-1B or another option. It could be an L, but there's a possibility that the TN may not be the best fit. So with that, let's go to the TN application process. I already shared quite a bit of information on this. Canadians have the option to apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico do not. What would they provide? They would provide a job offer letter. Okay, sorry about that. So Canadians can apply at a port of entry. What would they provide? So they would provide the original job offer letter and supporting documentation for the application. So that would be proof that they are a citizen of Canada in the form of their passport, as well as proof that they qualify for the listed profession. So that would be either their original diploma, their transcript. If they're qualifying based on experience, it would be original experience letters that are signed by their past employers talking about the fact that they have the required experience. One thing to note is that some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. You can find this information on the U.S. Customs and Border Protection or CBP website. For first-time applicants, it could be a good idea to go to one of these ports of entry. We, of course, are happy to help our clients navigate that process. It's what we do regularly. The other recommendation, we'll talk about this a bit later, is that you call the port of entry ahead of time just to make sure that you're aware of any unique procedures or requirements there. During COVID, there were a number of requirements put in place, so it's always good to check. Nationals of Mexico, if they're outside the US, must apply at a consulate. So they would first file a DS-160, which is an online form that goes to the consulate. They'd pay the visa application fee, schedule their biometrics, their fingerprints, and photos. They would schedule their interview. The consulate will usually reach out and invite them to do that, and then they would attend their TN interview. After the interview, if they're approved, the consulate will keep their passport for a few days, apply a TN visa stamp, and then they'll be able to enter the US. Certain nationals of Mexico who are renewing their TN may be eligible to renew by mail. The consulate will let them know if they qualify for that. And those who are applying from within the US, whether they're nationals of Canada or Mexico, the process is the same from within the US. And that would be to file for the employer to file the Form I-129 by sending it along with the supporting documents to USCIS. So finally, some tips and common pitfalls. As I mentioned, it's always a good idea to call ahead to the port of entry to make sure you're aware of the procedures and if there's particular hours that they're open, things like that. Make sure that the employer who the contact at the US employer who signed the employer letter is available by phone at the time you are either at the consulate or at the port of entry. Sometimes a government official will call that person and just to make sure that the job offer is legitimate. They usually don't go into much detail. They likely won't get into much detail about the job duties or things like that, but they will want to just confirm that this is a legitimate job offer. So always a good idea to tell your employer in the US, could you just have your phone on you? I plan to be at the border between noon and 3 o'clock. If you could just carry your phone during that time. If you're applying at a consulate or a port of entry, then bring the original diploma, original transcript, and original signed version of the employer letter, as well as original signed versions of any experience letters if you're qualifying based on experience. And that's because the government does encounter a good amount of fraud. And so they typically will not accept copies of signatures. So bring the originals. USCIS is okay with copies, but ports of entry as well as consulates generally want to see the originals. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. It's not a green card. So you always do need to be ready to show that you intend to leave the US at the end of your TN status. So this doesn't usually come up if you are on your first or second TN. But if you've been in the US on a TN for 8, 9, 10 years, you might start getting questions about, do you actually plan to, leave the US, or is your goal to permanently work in the US? And if that happens, you just want to have documents with you showing you maintain ties outside the US, whether that's copies of your bank statement, proof that you own property outside the US, things like that. So with that, we will go ahead and turn to the questions, and please feel free to continue sending those in. So the first question is, would positions with manager titles like quality manager or product manager be eligible to apply under the TN management consultant category? So the important thing to keep in mind is that the title of a job basically means nothing. What matters are your job duties. So, obviously that is an exaggeration. If your job title is economist and you're coming to the US to work as a biologist and your job duties are those of a biologist, being called an economist will raise questions. But by and large, it really does not matter that your job title says manager. Manager really has nothing to do with whether you're coming to the US to work as a management consultant. What matters is whether your job duties are aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook. I will say quality manager or product manager, go to the OOH, make sure what you're going to be doing in the US is aligned with what the OOH says management consultants do. If they are aligned, then I would say that is probably fine insofar as the job and the job duties are concerned. So yes, that can work, but don't think that the inquiry stops at the job title. It definitely does not. Could you own a smaller part of the US company, or does it raise flags when applying? So as I said before, just to give background, the US employer, the company you're coming to the US to work for, any US employer, an LLC, a corporation, a sole proprietor. The exception is that you cannot, as the TN applicant, own the US employer. So can you own 1%, 2%? It is risky. So what basically what the rule is that the TN does not allow self-employment. That is what the rule is. The rule is not, you can't own more than 1% of a company or something along those lines. So even owning 1% of a company does raise a question as to whether you are actually engaging in self-employment. So the answer is that it could raise flags to own any percentage of the US company. Um, Certainly more flags the more you own, but even owning a minority share in a US company would very likely raise flags when you're submitting a TN. So be careful of that. Minimum education and experience for TN. I'm not sure what the question is, but again, if you go to the TN regulations for each occupation, you will find the minimum requirements. So again, accountant, baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or a professional license, economist, baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. So you'll just need to look up your profession and see what the requirements are for that. All right, I think that covers all the questions that came in. Thank you very much for those questions. Thank you for joining me today for this presentation. If you do have questions, do reach out, schedule a consultation. We're always happy to talk through the specifics of your case and help you map out what your goals are and how to navigate those in the context of the visa. Do keep an eye out for our follow-up email, which will have the webinar, the PowerPoint you see on your screen, a link to our YouTube channel, and a link where you can schedule a consultation. Um, so, okay, one more question. If my master's degree is from the US, but undergraduate degree is from India, would that be okay, or do I need to get an equivalency certificate? So it depends on what you're using to qualify. So if you are qualifying as an economist and you have a master's degree in economics from the US, you do not need an equivalency because you are qualifying based on the master's in economics. The master's in economics is from the US, therefore you don't need an equivalency. But if you're qualifying based on the foreign degree and the foreign degree is not from the US, Canada, or Mexico, then yes, you need an equivalency. So in this example, if your master's degree is from the US and is in English, that's not going to be sufficient for economics and economists. But if your undergraduate degree from India is in economics, then yes, you need an equivalency. So it really depends on which degree you're relying on for the TN and where that degree was issued. Uh, can you talk a little more about the pathways of transferring from a TN to a green card? Sure. So we have a lot more information on this question on our YouTube channel. So I would recommend checking out our other webinars on this. We have videos, we have a number of blog posts. Basically, moving from a TN to a green card is possible, but is quite tricky. And the reason is that the TN is not dual intent. What that means is that if you apply for a TN or enter the US on a TN, you are representing to the government that you don't plan to pursue a green card on that visit. So the government does tend to be quite strict on this, though. So let's say you have a family member who files a family-based green card petition for you. Let's say you have a sibling. You're from India, you have a sibling in the US who's a US citizen, and they file a green card application for you. That green card can take decades to be approved. But the moment that they file an I-130, raises the risk that each time you enter on a TN, the government will say, I see you have a pending green card. I think you're planning to stay, therefore I'm not admitting you. So ways that you can mitigate that risk are to make sure you choose consular processing for your green card. um, which would require that you leave the US and apply at a consulate. If you're applying for an employment-based green card, the same rule apply, the same advice applies. You need to be careful each time you're entering on a TN. So it can be good to renew the TN before you begin pursuing the green card so that you at least have the visa or the 3 years approval before you pursue the green card. again, you need to be sincere in submitting your application. So if your goal is to apply for a green card, don't engage in misrepresentation and tell the government that that's not your goal. But if you renew the TN and then you have the opportunity to pursue a green card, there's no prohibition on that. You just need to be careful about the intent to issue each time you enter the US. And applying for the green card lottery in and of itself is not considered intent to immigrate. If you win the lottery and then you file an application for a green card, that's where you have triggered that intent. But simply entering the lottery is not sufficient. All right. Please do keep an eye out for our follow-up email. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the great questions. I do hope to see you all on future webinars, and feel free to reach out for a consultation if we can be helpful. Thank you so much. Have a great day.